When my daughter-in-law Amanda told me I wasn't invited to my grandson's birthday party, she said in a cold voice, "The party is for family only." I felt the blood drain from my face. But she had no idea she hadn't just drawn my tears. She had triggered the first step in a plan that would cost her every last cent of her precious fortune. Justice had to be served, and that arrogance had to be punished. You will not believe how that small gift I left on their doorstep that day was the beginning of their end. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what city you're listening from. I am Marilyn, a 69-year-old widow living in Los Angeles who buried her husband 10 years ago. My life has always revolved around two things: my son David and his 4-year-old boy, my only grandson Greg. I faced hardships raising my son, but I always raised him well. I'm that old-school mother, the one who holds the family together, the one who spends all day in the kitchen for every birthday, the one who bakes the most beautiful cake for her grandson, sparing no expense. Until my son married Amanda, that girl from a wealthy family. Amanda. She came from a world of luxury and glamour. The only thing that mattered to her was status. I, on the other hand, was a middle-class woman trying to get by on a widow's pension of just $1580 a month. I always felt like an outsider in their $1,000,000 mansion, like a piece of trash. In their world, my homemade cakes paled in comparison to the electric cars Amanda's family bought. My daughter-in-law was ashamed of my modest gifts. I knew it from the look on her face when she talked about me as useless to her high society friends. Still, I stayed silent for my grandson. That morning, I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, in the garden. "Marilyn, the music from the party is reaching the end of the street," she said cheerfully. "Greg is one lucky boy today." It felt like a punch to the gut. Party? What party? Trying to suppress the awful feeling inside me, I immediately called the house. Maybe they forgot, I thought to myself. Surely they wouldn't forget their own mother. Amanda answered the phone. Her voice, as always, was cold and distant. "Oh, Marilyn," she said, as if I had interrupted the most important task in the world. "It's Greg's birthday party today. I'll tell David you called." "I know, dear," I said, my voice trembling. I think my invitation must have gotten lost in the mail." There was a short silence on the line. Then I heard that icy sentence. "Marilyn, I'm sorry, but the party is for family only." "What do you mean?" I stammered. "I'm his grandmother. Emma and Michael are here," she said, referring to her own mother and father. "You understand, we're just having a small celebration with our real family." And she hung up the phone. Family only. So the woman who had spent years sacrificing for that family, the woman who raised her son, I wasn't family. While Amanda's rich family laughed with my grandson in that house, I was shut out. In that moment, the warmth inside me, that loving grandmother, froze. She died right there that day. That evening, I sat alone in my small living room, staring at the walls that had witnessed so many memories of David growing up, and I felt something shift inside me, something hard and cold, like a stone settling in my chest. But I wasn't going to cry anymore, no more tears for people who saw me as nothing. I got up from my chair, walked to the kitchen, and started baking a small cake for Greg, because no matter what Amanda thought of me, that little boy was still my grandson, and he deserved to know his grandmother loved him, even if his mother wanted to erase me from his life. I decorated it simply with blue frosting and wrote, "Happy birthday, Greg, love, Grandma Marilyn," in white letters. Then I wrapped a small book I had bought weeks ago, a collection of adventure stories for children, the kind I used to read to David when he was Greg's age, and I put it in a gift bag with tissue paper. Around 8 that evening, when I knew the party would be winding down, I drove to their mansion in my old Toyota, the one David always seemed embarrassed by when he saw it parked outside, and I walked up to their front door, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. I could hear laughter and music still playing inside and through the window. I saw Amanda's parents, Emma and Michael, holding champagne glasses while Greg ran around in a new superhero costume that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I placed the cake and the gift bag carefully on the doorstep, rang the bell, and walked quickly back to my car before anyone could answer. I wasn't going to give Amanda the satisfaction of turning me away to my face. As I drove home, something strange happened. Instead of feeling sad or rejected, I felt oddly calm, like I had just made a decision without fully realizing it yet. The old Marilyn, the one who always tried to keep the peace, who swallowed every insult with a smile, who baked cakes and pretended everything was fine, that Marilyn was gone, and in her place was someone new? Someone who had finally seen the truth about her daughter-in-law and wasn't going to take it anymore. The next morning, I woke up early, as always, made myself coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop. I wasn't tech-savvy, but I knew enough to do some basic research, and I started searching for information about Amanda's family business. You see, Emma and Michael Thornton owned a chain of high-end boutique hotels in Southern California, the kind of places where celebrities stayed and where a single night cost more than my monthly pension. The Thornton Hotel Group was their pride and joy, 5 luxury properties scattered from Los Angeles to San Diego, each one dripping with expensive art and designer furniture. Amanda had grown up in that world of privilege, never wanting for anything, never having to sacrifice or struggle, and that's why she looked down on people like me, people who had to count every dollar and make hard choices. I spent hours reading articles about the hotels, looking at their websites, checking their social media pages, and slowly a picture began to form in my mind. The Thorntons were wealthy, yes, but their business was built on image, on maintaining a reputation for exclusivity and perfection. Any scandal, any hint of impropriety could damage that carefully constructed facade. And as I dug deeper, I noticed something interesting in the online reviews. Several guests had complained about being overcharged, about hidden fees that appeared on their bills, about being pressured to upgrade to more expensive rooms. Most people probably didn't think twice about it, they just assumed it was normal for luxury hotels. But I saw it differently. I saw a pattern of taking advantage of people, of squeezing every last dollar out of customers who trusted the Thornton name. But I wasn't ready to do anything with that information. Yet I needed to be patient. I needed to be smart. So I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and went about my day as if nothing had changed. I did my grocery shopping. I watched my afternoon shows. I watered my small garden. But in the back of my mind I was thinking, planning, waiting for the right moment. 3 days after the birthday party, David finally called me. "Mom," he said, his voice apologetic. "I'm so sorry about Greg's party. Amanda told me what happened, and I feel terrible." I could hear the guilt in his voice. My boy had always been sensitive, always wanted to make everyone happy, but somewhere along the way, he had learned to prioritize his wife's feelings over mine. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone light, even though my heart was still bruised. "I understand you wanted to keep it small." There was a pause on the line, then he said, "Greg loved your cake, Mom. He said it was the best one at the party, and he's been reading that book every night before bed. He wants me to call you so you can hear him read." My heart swelled with love for my grandson, but I also felt a pang of sadness, because I knew that Amanda was probably standing nearby listening to this conversation, disapproving of David's decision to call me. I'd love that I told him, and a moment later, I heard Greg's sweet little voice on the phone, stumbling over words, as he tried to read me a story about a brave knight and a dragon. When he finished, he said, "Grandma, why didn't you come to my party?" And I had to swallow the lump in my throat before answering. "Oh, honey, Grandma had something important to do that day, but I'm so glad you liked your cake and your book." David took the phone back and said, "Mom, maybe we can have you over for dinner next week," and I agreed, knowing that Amanda would find some way to make me feel unwelcome in their home again. But as I hung up the phone, I realized something important. Greg loved me. My grandson knew who I was and appreciated what I did for him, and that meant Amanda hadn't won completely. She could try to push me out. She could make me feel like an outsider, but she couldn't erase the bond between a grandmother and her grandson. And that gave me strength. It reminded me why I was doing this, not for revenge exactly, but for justice, for the principle that you can't treat people like garbage just because they don't have as much money as you do. The following week, I did go to dinner at their house, and it was exactly as awkward as I expected. Amanda greeted me at the door with a fake smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and she was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my car. "Marilyn," she said in that syrupy tone she used when she was pretending to be nice, "how lovely to see you come in." The house was immaculate as always, everything perfectly arranged, every surface gleaming, the kind of home that looked more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. Greg ran up to me and threw his arms around my legs, shouting, "Grandma," and for a moment everything else faded away. I scooped him up and hugged him tight, breathing in that sweet little boy smell of soap and innocence. David looked relieved to see me. He kissed my cheek and took my coat, and we all moved into the dining room where the table was set with expensive china and crystal glasses. Emma and Michael were there too, of course, because apparently every family dinner now included Amanda's parents. Emma gave me a polite nod, the kind you'd give to someone you barely knew, and Michael didn't even look up from his phone. We sat down to eat, and the conversation was strained. Amanda dominated the discussion with stories about their recent trip to Napa Valley, about the exclusive wine tastings they'd attended, about the 5-star restaurant where they'd had dinner. I sat quietly eating my food, letting them talk, watching the dynamics of this family that had once been mine, but now felt like foreign territory. At one point, Greg asked me, "Grandma, can you make me another cake?" And before I could answer, Amanda cut in with, "Oh, sweetheart, Grandma's cakes are very sweet, but maybe for your next birthday, we'll order from that fancy bakery in Beverly Hills, the one that makes those amazing fondant creations." She said it casually, as if she were just making a suggestion, but I heard the underlying message. "Your grandmother's homemade cakes aren't good enough for us." David looked uncomfortable and tried to change the subject, but Emma jumped in with, "Oh yes, that bakery is wonderful. We ordered a cake from there for Michael's birthday last month, and it was absolutely stunning, wasn't it, dear?" Michael grunted in agreement without looking up from his phone. I smiled and said nothing, because what was there to say? I couldn't compete with their money. I couldn't match their expensive tastes, and they knew it. But as I watched them congratulate themselves on their refined palate and their luxurious lifestyle, I thought about what I had discovered in my research about those overcharged hotel guests, about the complaints that had been quietly swept under the rug, and I thought about how satisfying it would be to see that smug superiority wiped off their faces. After dinner, I helped clear the table despite Amanda's half-hearted protests, and I found myself alone in the kitchen with David for a few minutes. He looked tired, older than his 35 years, and I could see the stress lines around his eyes. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know things have been difficult, and I'm sorry. I wish—" He trailed off, not finishing the sentence, and I put my hand on his arm. "David, you don't have to apologize for your wife," I told him, even though part of me wished he would stand up to her more often. "I know you're trying to keep everyone happy, but sometimes you have to think about what's right, not just what's easy." He nodded, looking guilty, and then Amanda called from the other room asking him to help Michael with something, and the moment was over. As I drove home that night, I felt more determined than ever. I had tried to be the bigger person. I had swallowed my pride and shown up for that dinner, but nothing had changed. Amanda still looked down on me. Her parents still treated me like I was invisible, and David was too caught up in trying to please his wife to see what was really happening. So I went back to my research, spending late nights at my kitchen table, with my laptop digging deeper into the Thornton Hotel Group's business practices. I created a fake email address and started corresponding with some of the people who had left negative reviews, asking them about their experiences, documenting their complaints. One woman told me she had been charged twice for her room, and when she complained, the hotel staff had been dismissive and refused to issue a refund. Another man said he had been promised a complimentary spa treatment that never materialized, but the charge showed up on his bill anyway. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were part of a systematic pattern of deception. But I knew that collecting this information wasn't enough. I needed to do something with it, something that would make people pay attention. So I started thinking about the media, about how much the Thorntons valued their public image, about how devastating it would be if their shady business practices were exposed. I didn't have connections to reporters or journalists, but I did have something else. I had time, I had determination, and I had nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, I had compiled a document with dozens of customer complaints, screenshots of conversations, copies of receipts showing the overcharges, and detailed notes about the pattern I had discovered. I printed it all out and put it in a folder. Then I started researching consumer protection agencies and local news stations that covered business fraud. I wasn't sure how to proceed. I'd never done anything like this before, but I knew I had to try. Then, one evening, as I was watching the local news, I saw a segment about a reporter named Jessica Chen who specialized in investigative journalism exposing corporate wrongdoing and holding powerful people accountable. She had recently done a story about a real estate company that was scamming elderly homeowners, and watching her interview the victims with such compassion and determination, I knew she was the person I needed to contact. I found her email address on the news station's website and spent the next hour crafting a message trying to sound credible and coherent, not like some bitter old woman with a grudge. I explained who I was. I described the pattern of overcharges and deceptive practices at the Thornton hotels, and I attached some of the documentation I had collected. I wrote that I was concerned about other people being taken advantage of, that someone needed to hold the Thorntons accountable, and that I hoped she would consider investigating this story. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. For 3 days, I heard nothing, and I started to think she had dismissed my email as the ramblings of a crazy person. But then, on the 4th day, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Is this Marilyn?" a woman's voice asked, and when I said yes, she continued, "This is Jessica Chen from Channel 7 News. I received your email about the Thornton Hotel Group, and I'd like to meet with you to discuss it further. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon?" My heart raced as I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in downtown Los Angeles, and after I hung up, I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. This was really happening. I was really going through with this. The next day, I dressed carefully in my nicest outfit, a simple navy blue dress and cardigan, and I drove to the coffee shop, feeling nervous, but also strangely excited. Jessica Chen was already there when I arrived, a young woman in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a friendly smile. We shook hands, and she ordered us both coffee. Then we sat down in a quiet corner, where she pulled out a notebook and a recording device. "Mrs. Marilyn," she said, "I have to tell you, your email was fascinating. I did some preliminary research on the Thornton hotels, and I found several red flags. But I need to understand your motivation here. Why are you coming forward with this information?" I took a deep breath and told her the truth. Not all of it, not about Amanda excluding me from Greg's party or making me feel worthless, but enough to explain that I had stumbled upon this information and felt a moral obligation to share it. "I'm just a grandmother, on a fixed income," I said, "and when I see wealthy people taking advantage of others, overcharging them, and treating them poorly, it bothers me. I think someone should speak up for the people who can't afford to fight back." Jessica nodded, taking notes, and then she said, "I appreciate your honesty, and I want you to know that if I pursue this story, it will be based on facts and evidence, not personal grievances. Can you provide me with everything you've collected?" I handed her the folder and watched as she flipped through it, her eyes widening as she saw the volume of documentation I had assembled. "This is impressive," she said. "You've done more research than some professional investigators. Where did you learn to do this?" I smiled and said, "I have a lot of time on my hands, and the internet is a wonderful resource when you know how to use it." We spent the next 2 hours going through every complaint, every receipt, every screenshot, and Jessica asked me detailed questions about how I had verified the information. By the end of our meeting, she was clearly intrigued. "I'm going to need to do my own investigation," she said. "But I think there's definitely a story here. Give me a few weeks to dig deeper, and I'll be in touch." As I drove home that day, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. Part of me wondered if I was going too far, if I was letting my hurt feelings drive me to hurt others. But then, I remembered Amanda's cold voice on the phone, "The party is for family only," and I remembered Emma and Michael ignoring me at dinner, and I remembered all the times I had been made to feel small and worthless. And I thought about all those hotel guests who had been overcharged and dismissed people who deserved better. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about holding people accountable for their actions. Over the next 3 weeks, I heard nothing from Jessica, and I started to wonder if she had decided the story wasn't worth pursuing. I went about my normal routine, doing my shopping, tending my garden, talking to my neighbors, but always in the back of my mind, I was thinking about what might happen if the story came out. Would David be angry with me? Would he figure out that I was the one who had contacted the reporter? Would Amanda somehow trace this back to me? These questions kept me awake at night, but I also felt a sense of peace, like I had finally taken control of my own narrative, instead of letting others write it for me. Then one afternoon my phone rang, and it was Jessica. "Marilyn," she said, her voice excited. "I've been doing some serious digging into the Thornton Hotel Group, and what I've found is even worse than what you documented. There are tax irregularities, labor violations, several former employees who say they were pressured to participate in the overcharging schemes. This is a major story, and my station wants to run with it, but I need your permission to mention that a concerned citizen brought this to our attention. I won't use your name unless you want me to." I thought about it for a moment, weighing the pros and cons, and then I said, "You can mention that someone contacted you with concerns, but please don't use my name. I have family who are connected to the Thorntons, and I don't want to cause unnecessary complications." Jessica agreed and said the story would air in 2 days. She thanked me again for my help and promised to send me a link to the broadcast. For the next 48 hours, I was a bundle of nerves. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining how the Thorntons would react when they saw themselves on the news, how Amanda would panic about her family's reputation, how Emma and Michael would scramble to do damage control. Part of me felt bad for David, who would inevitably be caught in the middle of this mess, but I reminded myself that he had chosen to marry into that family. He had chosen to go along with their treatment of me, and sometimes people need to face consequences for their choices. The night the story aired, I sat in front of my television with my hands clasped in my lap, watching as Jessica Chen appeared on screen with her serious journalist expression. Tonight on Channel 7 News, she began an exclusive investigation into one of Southern California's most prestigious hotel chains. The Thornton Hotel Group has long been associated with luxury and exclusivity, but our investigation has uncovered a pattern of deceptive business practices that may have cost customers thousands of dollars. The screen showed footage of the beautiful hotel properties, then cut to interviews with former guests who described being overcharged and mistreated. One woman broke down in tears as she explained how she had saved for years to afford a stay at a Thornton hotel for her anniversary, only to be hit with unexpected charges that nearly maxed out her credit card. Then Jessica dropped the real bombshell. Our investigation has also revealed potential tax fraud and labor law violations. According to documents obtained by Channel 7 News, the Thornton Hotel Group may have been underreporting income to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, and several former employees have come forward with allegations of being pressured to work off the clock and denied proper overtime compensation. The screen showed redacted documents and pixelated interviews with former employees, who were too afraid to show their faces. Jessica concluded the segment by saying, "We reached out to Emma and Michael Thornton for comment, but they declined to be interviewed. The California Attorney General's office has confirmed they are now looking into these allegations." I sat there stunned, even though I had known this was coming. Seeing it on television made it real in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Jessica had done an incredible job. The story was thorough and balanced, presenting facts rather than speculation, and the implications were devastating for the Thorntons. Their precious reputation, the thing they valued above everything else, was now in ruins, and there would be investigations, lawsuits, possibly even criminal charges. I picked up my phone and saw that I already had 3 missed calls from David. My heart sank because I knew what was coming. He would be upset and confused, caught between his loyalty to his wife's family and his love for his mother. I didn't call him back that night. I needed time to prepare myself for that conversation. So instead, I went to bed and lay there in the dark, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Tomorrow my life would change in ways I couldn't predict. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel a small sense of triumph because justice had been served, and the people who had treated me like garbage were finally facing consequences. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7 o'clock, and it didn't stop. David called 6 times before I finally answered. "Mom?" He said, his voice tight with stress. "Have you seen the news? Did you see what they're saying about Amanda's parents? This is a nightmare. The hotels are getting bombarded with cancellation requests. There are protesters outside the Beverly Hills property, Emma is having a breakdown, and Michael is meeting with lawyers all day." I took a deep breath and said, "David, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I know it must be difficult trying to sound sympathetic, even though part of me was thinking that maybe this was exactly what needed to happen." "Difficult?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Mom, this could destroy their business, destroy our family. Amanda is convinced that someone from inside leaked information to the press. She's going through lists of former employees she's talking about filing lawsuits for defamation. This is insane." I felt a small flutter of fear in my chest. What if Amanda somehow figured out it was me? What if she traced the investigation back to my initial email to Jessica? But then I reminded myself that I had been careful. I had used a fake email address. I hadn't left any obvious trail. "David," I said calmly, "maybe if the Thorntons have nothing to hide, they have nothing to worry about. Investigations like this don't happen without reason." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then David said quietly, "Mom, you sound almost glad about this. Do you have any idea how much stress Amanda is under right now? She's crying all the time. She can't sleep. She feels like her whole world is falling apart." And I wanted to say, well, now she knows how it feels. Now she knows what it's like to be excluded and dismissed and treated like you don't matter. But instead, I just said, "I'm sorry she's suffering. But sometimes the truth has to come out, even when it's painful." Over the next few days, the story continued to dominate local news. More former employees came forward with allegations, more guests filed complaints with consumer protection agencies, and the Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the Thornton Hotel Group's financial practices. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my small living room, feeling like I was watching a movie, rather than something I had set in motion. Amanda's face appeared on the news one evening. She was leaving their mansion, surrounded by reporters shouting questions, and she looked haggard and terrified, her usual polished appearance replaced by dark circles under her eyes and unwashed hair. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered that cold voice saying family only, and my sympathy evaporated. David stopped calling me after that first conversation, and I knew that Amanda had probably convinced him I was somehow celebrating their misfortune, which wasn't entirely untrue, though I would never admit it. I missed talking to my son, missed hearing Greg's voice, but I told myself this was temporary. Eventually the dust would settle, and we could rebuild our relationship. In the meantime, I focused on my own life. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching other seniors how to use computers and navigate the internet, and I found it deeply satisfying to help people who reminded me of myself, people who had been left behind by the digital age, but still had so much to offer. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the story broke, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Emma Thornton in the produce section. She was wearing sunglasses despite being indoors, and she looked like she had aged 10 years. When she saw me, she froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Marilyn," she finally said, her voice strained. "I suppose you've heard about our troubles." I nodded and said yes. I saw it on the news. It must be very difficult for your family trying to sound neutral and sympathetic. Emma's face twisted into something ugly, and she stepped closer to me, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "You know what?" I think she hissed. "I think you're secretly enjoying this. I think you've always been jealous of us, of what we have, of our success, And now you're probably sitting at home gloating while we lose everything." I felt my face flush with anger, but I kept my voice steady as I replied, "Emma, I would never wish this kind of trouble on anyone, but if your family did something wrong, if you took advantage of people and broke the law, then you have to face the consequences. That's not my doing, that's yours." She stared at me with such hatred that I actually took a step back, and then she turned and walked away, her cart abandoned in the middle of the aisle. That encounter shook me more than I wanted to admit. I went home and sat in my kitchen thinking about Emma's accusation. Was I really just a jealous, bitter old woman getting revenge on people who had more than me? Or was I genuinely trying to right a wrong to hold people accountable for hurting others? The line between those two things felt blurry now, and I wasn't sure where I stood on it. But then I thought about all those hotel guests who had been scammed, about the employees who had been exploited, about the taxes that hadn't been paid while Emma and Michael lived in their mansion and bought their grandson electric cars, and I felt my resolve strengthen. This wasn't about me versus them. This was about justice versus corruption, about speaking up for people who couldn't speak for themselves. The investigation continued to expand. Federal authorities got involved because the tax fraud allegations crossed state lines, and it came out that the Thorntons had been using offshore accounts to hide income, which made the whole thing even more scandalous. Michael Thornton resigned as CEO of the hotel group, and Emma stepped down from the board of directors, both of them claiming they were doing it to protect the company from further damage. But everyone knew they were just trying to save themselves from criminal prosecution. The hotels stayed open, but occupancy rates plummeted. Nobody wanted to stay at a place that had been exposed for cheating its customers, and within a month, 2 of the 5 properties had closed permanently, putting dozens of people out of work. I felt a pang of guilt about those workers who lost their jobs. They were innocent victims of the Thorntons' greed, but I reminded myself that I hadn't created this situation. I had only exposed it. If the Thorntons hadn't been running their business dishonestly in the first place, none of this would have happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unleashed something bigger than I had anticipated. Like I had pulled a thread and watched an entire tapestry unravel, and now I wasn't sure if I could live with the consequences. 3 weeks after the news story aired, I received a letter in the mail from a law firm representing the Thornton Hotel Group. My hands shook as I opened it and read the formal legal language accusing me of defamation, conspiracy to damage their business reputation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were demanding compensation for their losses and threatening to file a lawsuit if I didn't respond within 30 days. I sat there staring at the letter in disbelief. How had they connected me to the investigation? Had Jessica Chen mentioned my involvement? Had someone seen me meeting with her at the coffee shop? My mind raced with possibilities, and I felt panic rising in my chest. I immediately called Jessica Chen, and when she answered, I said without preamble, "Did you tell the Thorntons that I contacted you about their business practices?" There was a pause, and then she said carefully, "Marilyn, I told you I would keep your identity confidential, and I have. I never mentioned your name to anyone associated with the Thorntons." "Why are you asking?" I explained about the letter, and she was silent for a long moment, then said, "That's interesting. They're fishing. They have no idea who brought this to my attention, so they're probably sending threatening letters to anyone they think might have had a motive to expose them. Don't worry about it. They have no case. You didn't defame anyone. You simply provided truthful information to a journalist. That's protected activity, and they know it. This is just intimidation tactics." Her words reassured me somewhat, but I still felt uneasy. I didn't have money for lawyers or legal battles. My pension barely covered my basic living expenses, and if the Thorntons really came after me, I would be in serious trouble. I decided to consult with a lawyer myself, just to understand my options, so I made an appointment with a legal aid service that helped low-income seniors. The attorney I met, with a kind woman named Patricia Rodriguez, reviewed the letter and agreed with Jessica that it was likely a bluff. "They're trying to scare you into revealing yourself," Patricia explained, "but they have to prove damages, and they have to prove that you knowingly spread false information. And from what you've told me, Everything you shared with the reporter was documented and truthful. My advice is to ignore this letter. Don't respond. Don't engage. Just let it sit there and see what happens. So, that's what I did. I filed the letter away in a drawer and tried to go on with my life, but the anxiety gnawed at me constantly. Every time my phone rang, I worried it would be a process server. Every time I checked my mail, I expected to see another threatening letter. I started having trouble sleeping, and I lost my appetite. My neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, commented that I looked thin and asked if I was feeling all right. But I couldn't tell her what was really going on. I couldn't tell anyone. Meanwhile, the situation with David and Amanda continued to deteriorate. I hadn't heard from my son in over a month, and I missed him terribly, missed Greg's little voice on the phone, missed feeling like I was part of their lives, even if that feeling had been mostly an illusion. I thought about calling David, but I was afraid of what he might say. Afraid he had chosen his wife's family over me completely. So I waited, hoping he would reach out first. But the silence stretched on, feeling heavier with each passing day. Then, one Saturday morning in late November, I was surprised to see David's car pull up in front of my house. My heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear as I watched him get out and walk toward my door, but he was alone. No Amanda, no Greg, just my son looking tired and troubled. I opened the door before he could knock, and we stood there for a moment just looking at each other. Then he said, "Can I come in?" Mom and I stepped aside to let him enter. We sat down in my living room, and there was an awkward silence before David finally spoke. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, his voice serious. "Did you have anything to do with that news investigation into the Thorntons? Did you contact that reporter?" My mind raced, trying to decide how to answer. If I lied, he might never forgive me when he found out the truth. But if I told him the truth now, he might never forgive me at all. I looked into my son's eyes and decided that honesty was the only option. "Yes," I said quietly. "I was the one who contacted Jessica Chen. I had discovered information about the Thorntons' business practices, and I felt it was important to bring it to light. I'm not sorry I did it, David, because people were being hurt, but I am sorry for the pain it's caused you and Greg." David closed his eyes and rubbed his face with both hands, and when he opened them again, I saw disappointment and anger and something else, maybe a grudging understanding. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "do you have any idea what you've done? Amanda's family is being torn apart. They might face criminal charges. They've lost millions of dollars in my marriage." He trailed off, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "Your marriage?" what I asked gently, and David shook his head. "Amanda blames me," he said. "She thinks I should have protected her family somehow, should have known something was wrong, and warned them, and when she found out that you might have been involved, she lost it completely. She said I had to choose between her and you, and when I hesitated when I said you were still my mother, and I couldn't just cut you out of my life, she told me to get out of the house. I felt my heart break for my son. This wasn't what I had wanted. I had never intended to destroy his marriage or make him choose between the two women in his life. "David, I'm so sorry," I said, reaching for his hand. "I never meant to hurt you." I was angry and hurt after being excluded from Greg's birthday party, after being treated like I didn't matter, and yes, maybe part of me wanted to see Amanda's family taken down a notch. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about doing what was right, about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. David pulled his hand away and stood up, pacing across my small living room. "Mom, I get it," he said. "I understand why you were hurt. I should have stood up to Amanda about the party. I should have insisted you be included. But this is nuclear. You didn't just hurt Amanda's family. You hurt me, and you hurt Greg. My son is asking why we don't live with Mommy anymore, and I don't know what to tell him." The mention of Greg made my eyes fill with tears. My precious grandson caught in the middle of adult conflicts he couldn't possibly understand. This was the part I hadn't fully thought through when I set everything in motion, the collateral damage to innocent people. "Can I see him?" I asked, my voice breaking. Can I see Greg? David looked at me for a long moment and then shook his head. Not right now, Mom. Amanda has full custody right now since I moved out, and she's made it very clear that she doesn't want you anywhere near him. She thinks you're a destructive force in our family, and she's probably right. That last sentence hit me like a physical blow, and I felt something inside me crumble. So that's it then, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She wins. She gets to cut me out completely and turn my grandson against me, and you're just going to let her do it. David's face flushed with anger. Don't put this on me, he said, raising his voice. You started this, Mom. You went behind everyone's back and blew up their lives. You don't get to play the victim now. I came here today because, despite everything, you're still my mother, and I still love you, but I don't know if I can forgive what you've done. I need time to figure out where we go from here. He left without saying goodbye, and I stood at my window watching his car disappear down the street. Then I collapsed onto my couch and cried harder than I had cried in years. Not just for myself, but for David, for Greg, for all the broken pieces of our family that I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. In that moment, I questioned everything. Had I been right to expose the Thorntons? Or had I just been a vengeful old woman lashing out at people who had hurt my feelings? Had the ends justified the means? Or had I crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? These questions tormented me, but I had no good answers. The next few weeks were the darkest of my life, darker even than when I lost my husband 10 years ago. At least then, I had my son and grandson to comfort me, to give me a reason to keep going. But now, I had pushed them away, and I was truly alone. I stopped volunteering at the community center, stopped answering my phone when neighbors called, stopped doing much of anything except sitting in my house and replaying all my mistakes. Mrs. Peterson came by a few times to check on me and brought me casseroles that I barely touched. She could see I was struggling, but she didn't pry, just left the food and told me to call if I needed anything. Then, in early December, I received a phone call from Patricia Rodriguez, the legal aid lawyer I had consulted about the threatening letter from the Thorntons. Marilyn, she said, sounding pleased, I wanted to let you know that the Thornton Hotel Group has officially dropped their threats against you. They've got much bigger problems now. The Attorney General's office has filed formal charges, and they're too busy trying to save themselves to worry about you. You're in the clear. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I just felt numb. It didn't matter anymore whether I was in legal trouble or not. I had already lost everything that mattered to me. Thank you for letting me know, I said quietly, and Patricia hesitated before asking, Are you okay, Marilyn? You don't sound like yourself. I assured her I was fine and ended the call, then went back to staring at the television without really seeing it. This is what victory felt like, I realized. Hollow and bitter, and nothing like I had imagined. Christmas approached, and for the first time in decades, I had no plans, no family gathering to prepare for, no gifts to wrap for Greg, no reason to bake cookies or decorate my house. I thought about all the Christmases past when David was a boy, and we would spend the whole day together, just the two of us after his father died, making traditions and memories, and I wondered how we had ended up here, so far apart, so broken. I knew the answer, of course. I had made choices, and those choices had consequences. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. On Christmas Eve, I was sitting in my dark living room, having not bothered to put up a tree or even a single decoration, when there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me, so I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. Standing on my doorstep, looking small and uncertain, was my son David, and next to him, holding his hand, was Greg. I opened the door so fast I almost pulled it off its hinges, and Greg immediately let go of David's hand and ran to me, throwing his arms around my legs just like he always did. "Grandma," he shouted, and I picked him up even though he was getting too big for me to carry easily, holding him tight and breathing in that sweet little boy smell. Over his shoulder, I looked at David, and saw tears running down my son's face. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said softly, and I started crying too, still holding Greg, who was chattering away about how Daddy had told him they were going to surprise Grandma. We went inside, and I turned on all the lights, suddenly embarrassed that my house looked so dark and depressing. But David just smiled and said, "Don't worry about it, Mom. We brought decorations," and he went back to his car and returned with a small artificial tree, a box of ornaments, and grocery bags full of food. For the next hour, we decorated that tree together. Greg excited to hang every ornament, and it felt like old times, like maybe things could be okay again, but I knew we needed to talk about everything that had happened. We couldn't just pretend the past few months hadn't occurred. After we put Greg in front of the television with some cartoons, David and I sat down at my kitchen table with cups of coffee, and he looked at me seriously. "Mom," he began, "I've had a lot of time to think since our last conversation, and I've realized some things. First, Amanda and I are getting divorced. It's not just because of what happened with her parents, though. That was certainly part of it. It's because I finally saw how she had been treating you all along, and I realized I didn't like the person I was becoming when I was with her. Someone who let his mother be disrespected and excluded. Someone who valued money and status over family and loyalty. I started to protest, to say he didn't need to get divorced because of me, but he held up his hand to stop me. "Let me finish," he said. "Second, what you did exposing the Thorntons, was it perfect? No. Would I have preferred you came to me first? Yes. But was it the wrong thing to do? I don't think so anymore. Because I've learned things about Emma and Michael, that I never knew, things that Amanda kept hidden from me, like how they treated their employees, how they looked down on anyone who wasn't wealthy, how they were teaching those same values to Amanda, and she was passing them on to Greg. And I don't want my son growing up thinking that money is all that matters, that some people are worth more than others based on their bank accounts. Mom, you stood up for what was right, even though it cost you dearly, even though you knew people would hate you for it, and that takes courage. I'm not saying everything you did was perfect, but I understand why you did it, and I respect you for it, so I'm here tonight to tell you that I choose you. I choose family, the real kind of family that shows up and cares about each other, not the fake kind that's all about appearances and social status." By the time he finished talking, we were both crying again, and I reached across the table to take his hands in mine. "David, I'm so sorry for everything that happened," I said. "I never wanted to hurt you or break up your marriage. I just wanted to be treated with respect, to be seen as valuable, to matter." "You do matter, Mom," he said fiercely. "You've always mattered, and I'm sorry it took me so long to show you that. I'm sorry I let Amanda treat you the way she did. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to include you in Greg's life. I'm going to do better, I promise you." We sat there for a while just holding hands across the table, and then Greg came running in, asking if we could make Christmas cookies like Grandma used to make, and David and I looked at each other and laughed, so we spent the rest of the evening baking cookies and singing carols and being a family again, and it was the best Christmas gift I could have asked for. David and Greg stayed over that night, David sleeping on my couch, and Greg curled up in what used to be David's childhood bedroom. And when I woke up Christmas morning to the sound of my grandson's laughter, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe we couldn't change what had happened, but we could move forward. We could rebuild. We could be stronger than before. Over the next few weeks, as David went through the divorce proceedings with Amanda, more details came out about the Thornton situation. Michael and Emma had both been indicted on multiple counts of tax fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. They were facing potential prison time, and their remaining hotel properties were being sold off to pay back taxes and penalties. Amanda had moved back in with her parents, who were now living in a much smaller house, having sold their mansion to cover legal fees, and from what David told me, she was bitter and angry, blaming everyone but herself and her family for their downfall. The divorce was contentious at first. Amanda tried to get full custody of Greg and tried to prevent me from having any contact with my grandson, but her lawyer eventually advised her that given her family's legal troubles and the fact that David had been the more stable parent throughout this ordeal, she wasn't in a strong position to make demands. They eventually settled on joint custody, with David having Greg during the school week and Amanda having him on weekends. And crucially, David insisted that I be allowed to see Greg whenever I wanted, and Amanda had to agree or risk losing even more in the settlement. I tried not to gloat about how things had turned out, tried not to feel too much satisfaction at seeing the Thorntons brought low. But I'm only human, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel vindicated. They had treated me like garbage, had excluded me from my grandson's life, had looked down on me for being poor and ordinary, and now they were facing the consequences of their own actions, their own greed and dishonesty and arrogance. I hadn't destroyed them. They had destroyed themselves. I had simply held up a mirror and shown the world who they really were. In January, David and Greg moved into a modest apartment not far from my house, and I helped them get settled. It was nothing like the mansion they had lived in with Amanda, just a 2-bedroom place with basic furniture and none of the luxury they had been accustomed to, but Greg seemed happy there. He had his own room decorated with posters of superheroes, he had his books and toys, and most importantly, he had his father and his grandmother, who loved him unconditionally, not for what he had, but for who he was. One Saturday afternoon in late January, I was at David's apartment helping him organize the kitchen when Greg came running in from his bedroom holding something. "Grandma, look what I found," he said, and I saw he was holding the adventure book I had given him for his birthday, the one I had left on the doorstep after being excluded from the party. "This is my favorite book," Greg said. "Daddy reads it to me every night." "Thank you for giving it to me." I felt tears prick my eyes as I hugged him, thinking about how that small gesture, that gift left in rejection and hurt, had become something precious to my grandson. Sometimes the smallest acts of love have the biggest impact. David smiled at me over Greg's head, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. That we had been through hell, but we had come out the other side together. That family wasn't about money or status or big expensive gifts. It was about showing up and being there and loving each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. In February, the legal case against the Thorntons went to trial, and it was all over the news. Jessica Chen continued to cover the story, and I watched every broadcast. Emma and Michael's lawyers tried every trick in the book to get the charges dismissed or reduced, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, testimony from former employees, documentation of the offshore accounts. It was an open and shut case. The jury found them guilty on almost all counts, and they were sentenced to 5 years in federal prison each, in addition to having to pay millions in restitution to the government and to the customers they had defrauded. Amanda's world completely collapsed after her parents were sentenced. She had to take a job as a receptionist at a dental office, a far cry from her previous life of leisure and luxury. She struggled to make ends meet, and according to David, she was constantly complaining about how unfair life was, how they had been targeted and persecuted, never once acknowledging that her parents had brought this on themselves through their own illegal actions. One day in March, I was at the grocery store doing my weekly shopping when I saw Amanda in the checkout line, ahead of me. She looked different, older, wearing cheap clothes instead of designer labels, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was buying generic brands and counting out coupons, clearly watching every penny, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. This was a woman who had lost everything, whose parents were in prison, whose marriage had ended, whose comfortable life had been stripped away. She must have felt someone watching her, because she turned around and our eyes met. I saw recognition flash across her face, followed by a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, shame, resentment, fear. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and then I did something that surprised both of us. I smiled at her, not a gloating smile or a vindictive smile, but a genuine smile of someone who understood what it was like to struggle. And I said quietly, "Hello, Amanda. How are you holding up?" She blinked in surprise, and I could see her deciding how to respond. Part of her clearly wanted to lash out at me, to blame me for everything that had happened to her family. But she must have been too tired or too beaten down, because instead she just said, "I'm managing." There was an awkward pause, and then she added, "I know you probably hate me for how I treated you, and you probably think I deserve everything that's happened. and maybe you're right. I shook my head. Amanda, I don't hate you, I said. I won't pretend you didn't hurt me because you did, but I don't take any pleasure in seeing you suffer like this. What happened to your parents was a result of their own choices, their own actions, not yours and not mine. I hope you can rebuild your life and find some peace. She looked at me with something like wonder, as if she couldn't understand why I wasn't being cruel to her, and then her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry for everything, for excluding you from Greg's party, for treating you like you were worthless, for being such a snob. You didn't deserve that. You were always kind to us, and I threw it back in your face. It was the first time Amanda had ever apologized to me for anything, and I could tell it cost her something to say it. Her pride, her ego, whatever, was left of the person she used to be. I reached out and touched her arm gently. I accept your apology, I said, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry too. Sorry that exposing your parents' business practices hurt you so much. I didn't set out to destroy your life. I just wanted to stop them from hurting other people. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and then said, Can I ask you something? How did you do it? How did you go from being so hurt and rejected to taking action like that? I would have just cried and felt sorry for myself, but you actually did something. I thought about her question for a moment, considering how to answer honestly. Amanda, when you told me I wasn't family, when you excluded me from my grandson's birthday party, something broke inside me, I said. But instead of just breaking it, transformed into something else, into a determination to prove that I mattered, that I had value, that I couldn't be dismissed so easily. And yes, part of it was about revenge. I won't lie about that, but it was also about justice, about standing up for all the other people your parents had hurt, the employees who were exploited, the customers who were cheated. Someone needed to speak up for them, and I realized I could be that person. Amanda listened intently, and then said something that surprised me. I wish I had your strength, she said. I've always relied on other people, on my parents' money, on my husband's support, on my family's reputation, and now that all of that is gone, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know how to be a person without all those external things defining me. It was perhaps the most honest and vulnerable thing I had ever heard her say, and in that moment, I saw her not as the cruel daughter-in-law who had hurt me, but as a lost and frightened woman trying to find her way. Amanda, you're stronger than you think, I said. You're working, you're supporting yourself, you're taking care of Greg on the weekends. Those are all hard things, and you're doing them. You're rebuilding your life piece by piece, and that takes real courage. Give yourself some credit. She gave me a watery smile and said, Thank you, Marilyn. That means more than you know. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I appreciate it. We parted ways in that grocery store parking lot, and as I drove home, I thought about how strange life was. How the person I had once wanted to see brought down was now someone I felt compassion for. How revenge had turned into something more complicated, something more human. I had gotten what I wanted. Justice had been served. The Thorntons had faced consequences for their actions, but it didn't feel triumphant anymore. It just felt sad and messy and real. That evening, I told David about running into Amanda and our conversation, and he looked surprised. You were nice to her? He asked, after everything she did to you? I nodded and said, David, holding on to anger and bitterness doesn't hurt her. It hurts me. I spent so much energy being angry at Amanda and her parents, plotting their downfall, and yes, I achieved what I set out to do. But now what? Do I keep hating her forever? Or do I choose to move forward, to let go of the resentment, and focus on building a good life for myself and for us as a family? David smiled and said, Mom, you never cease to amaze me. Most people would be gloating right now, enjoying seeing their enemies suffer, but you're taking the high road, being the bigger person. I'm proud of you. His words warmed my heart, and I realized that this was what real victory looked like. Not crushing your enemies, but rising above the conflict. Not seeking revenge, but seeking peace. not destroying others, but building yourself up. In April, something unexpected happened. Jessica Chen contacted me again. She was working on a follow-up story about the Thornton case, and she wanted to interview me on camera this time, not as an anonymous source, but as the person who had blown the whistle. "Your story is inspiring, Marilyn," she said. "You're a regular person who saw something wrong and had the courage to speak up, even though it cost you personally. I think people need to hear that, need to know that one person really can make a difference." I was hesitant, at first worried about drawing more attention to myself, worried about how Amanda and David might react, but Jessica was persuasive, and eventually I agreed. The interview was scheduled for late April, and I was incredibly nervous as the day approached. I bought a new outfit for the occasion, nothing fancy, just a nice blouse and skirt, and I practiced what I was going to say, trying to strike the right tone, honest but not vindictive, serious but not preachy. When the day came, Jessica and her camera crew arrived at my house and set up in my living room, and we spent 2 hours talking about everything that had happened, about being excluded from Greg's party, about discovering the Thorntons' fraudulent business practices, about making the decision to contact the press, about the aftermath and the consequences. Jessica asked tough questions, like whether I regretted what I had done, and whether I felt responsible for the Thorntons going to prison, and I answered as honestly as I could. Do I regret that my actions led to people suffering? Yes, of course I do, I said, but do I regret exposing fraud and corruption? Absolutely not. The Thorntons made their own choices. They chose to break the law. They chose to cheat people. They chose to value money over integrity. I simply brought those choices to light, and as for prison, that was decided by a jury and a judge, not by me. They're facing consequences for their own actions, not mine. When the interview aired in early May, it created quite a stir. Some people praised me as a hero, a brave whistleblower who had stood up to powerful people. Others criticized me as a vengeful woman who had used legitimate concerns as a cover for a personal vendetta. I read some of the online comments, and they ranged from supportive to viciously cruel. But I tried not to let either the praise or the criticism affect me too much. I had done what I thought was right, and I had to live with the results, good and bad. What surprised me most was the number of people who reached out to me after the interview aired. Other seniors who had been dismissed or disrespected by their families, people who had witnessed wrongdoing but were afraid to speak up, victims of corporate fraud, who felt validated seeing the Thorntons held accountable. I received dozens of letters and emails thanking me for my courage, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, and I realized that my experience had resonated with something larger. A feeling that ordinary people were being taken advantage of by those with power and money, and that someone needed to fight back. I started writing responses to some of these letters, offering what encouragement and wisdom I could, and before long, I found myself becoming an accidental advocate, speaking at community centers about consumer protection, teaching seniors how to recognize scams and fraud using my story to empower others to stand up for themselves. It was never something I had planned or sought out, but it gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. A feeling that maybe all the pain and conflict and drama had been worth it if it helped other people. By summer, David's divorce from Amanda was finalized, and he had full custody of Greg during the week, with Amanda having him every other weekend. Their relationship had become more cordial, less hostile. Amanda was working hard at her job and seemed to be genuinely trying to turn her life around. She was even attending therapy to deal with her issues around money and status and self-worth. One afternoon she called me, which was shocking in itself, because we had barely spoken since our encounter at the grocery store, and she asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, curious about what she wanted to say, and we met at a small cafe near her apartment. She looked better than she had a few months ago, still not the polished society woman she used to be, but healthier, more at peace with herself. We sat down with our coffees, and there was an awkward silence before Amanda took a deep breath and said, "Marilyn, I've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of therapy, and I've come to realize how toxic my upbringing was. How my parents taught me that people's worth was measured by their bank accounts, by their possessions, by their social status, and I absorbed all of that without questioning it. I treated you horribly. She continued, her voice shaking slightly. I excluded you. I looked down on you. I made you feel worthless, all because you didn't fit into my narrow definition of what mattered. And I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of the person I was, and I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, trying to teach Greg different values than the ones I was raised with. Values about kindness and respect and treating people well regardless of how much money they have. I listened to her speak, and I could see that she was being sincere. That this wasn't just empty words, but a real transformation happening inside her. Amanda, I appreciate you saying all of this, I said, and I can see that you're working hard to change. That takes courage and self-awareness. I forgive you for how you treated me, I really do, and I hope we can move forward and maybe even build a better relationship for Greg's sake, if nothing else. She smiled with relief and said, Thank you, Marilyn, that means everything to me. And I want you to know that I've told Greg he can see you anytime he wants. I'm not going to keep you from your grandson anymore. You're his family, and he loves you, and that's what matters. We talked for another hour, really talked for the first time ever about our lives, our struggles, our hopes for the future. And by the time we parted ways, I felt like maybe something good had come out of all this mess. As summer turned to fall, I settled into a new routine. I spent time with Greg several days a week, sometimes at David's apartment, sometimes at my house where we would bake cookies and read books and play games. I continued my advocacy work, speaking at events and writing articles about consumer protection and standing up to corporate fraud. I even started a small blog where I shared stories from other people who had blown the whistle on wrongdoing, creating a community of people who had chosen to speak up rather than stay silent. David was thriving too. He had started dating someone new, a kind woman named Lisa, who was a teacher at Greg's school, and watching him laugh and smile again reminded me of the boy he used to be before he got caught up in Amanda's world of wealth and status. Greg adored Lisa, and she was wonderful with him, patient and loving and genuinely interested in being part of his life. One Sunday afternoon in October, David brought Lisa over to my house for dinner, and the four of us sat around my small kitchen table eating pot roast and mashed potatoes. And Greg was chattering away about his school projects, and Lisa was asking me about my advocacy work, and David was looking at all of us with such contentment. In that moment, I realized that this was what I had been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not vindication, not even justice really, but this. This feeling of being valued and included and loved. Of being part of a family that respected me and treated me like I mattered. The Thorntons had tried to make me invisible, had tried to erase me from their lives, but instead, their actions had set in motion a chain of events that brought me here to this table with these people who truly cared about me. Later that evening, after David and Greg and Lisa had gone home, I sat on my porch watching the sunset and thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. I thought about that phone call with Amanda when she told me the party was for family, only about the moment I decided to fight back, instead of just accepting her rejection about all the twists and turns that had led me to this place. Had it been worth it, all the pain and conflict and drama, I asked myself, and the answer was complicated, but ultimately, yes. Because I had found my voice, I had discovered my strength. I had learned that even an ordinary 69-year-old widow on a fixed income could make a difference if she had the courage to try. The following month in November, exactly 1 year after Greg's birthday party, where I had been excluded, David organized a surprise party at his apartment. When I arrived, I was shocked to see not just David and Greg and Lisa, but also Amanda looking nervous, but smiling genuinely, and several of my neighbors, including Mrs. Peterson, and some of the people I had met through my advocacy work, and even Jessica Chen, who had come with a small camera crew to document what she called the real ending to the Thornton story. Greg ran up to me shouting, "Surprise, Grandma, it's your party," and I looked around confused until David explained. "Mom, you spent your whole life throwing parties for other people, making cakes for us, celebrating our milestones, but nobody ever celebrated you. So today we're changing that. Today is about honoring you and everything you've done, not just for our family, but for all the people you've helped this year." There was a beautiful cake, not store-bought from some fancy bakery, but homemade by Greg, with David's help, decorated with slightly messy frosting that spelled out "We love Grandma Marilyn" in wobbly letters. There were speeches. Mrs. Peterson talked about what a good neighbor I had been for all these years. Jessica talked about my courage in standing up to corruption. Lisa talked about how much Greg loved me and how David's face lit up whenever he talked about his mother, and then Amanda stood up and everyone got quiet. "A year ago, I made the worst mistake of my life," Amanda said, her voice steady but emotional. "I told Marilyn she wasn't family. I excluded her from her grandson's birthday party because I was shallow and cruel and valued all the wrong things. But Marilyn didn't let that break her. Instead, she stood up not just for herself, but for everyone my family had hurt, and in doing so, she taught me what real strength looks like, what real values are, what family really means." She turned to look at me directly. "Marilyn, you won, not because my parents went to prison or because I lost everything I thought mattered, but because you showed all of us what it means to have integrity, to fight for what's right, even when it costs you to choose principle over comfort. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be more like you and less like the person I used to be. Thank you." By the time she finished, everyone was crying, including me, and Greg came over and hugged me tight and said, "Grandma, you're my hero." And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Complete and total peace. I had been hurt, yes. I had been rejected and dismissed and treated like I didn't matter, but I had risen above it. I had turned that pain into action, that rejection into purpose, and now here I was, surrounded by people who loved me and valued me and saw me for who I truly was. We ate cake and laughed and shared stories, and at one point I caught Amanda's eye across the room and we exchanged a smile. Not the fake society smile she used to give me, but a real smile of understanding and respect. She had lost her money and her status and her parents' empire, but she had gained something more valuable. Humility and self-awareness and the chance to become a better person. And I had lost my illusions about my daughter-in-law and my safe, comfortable silence, but I had gained my voice and my power and my sense of self-worth. As the party wound down and people started leaving, David pulled me aside and said, "Mom, I'm so proud of you. Not just for what you did to the Thorntons, but for how you've handled everything since. For being gracious in victory, for showing compassion to Amanda, even after how she treated you, for using your experience to help other people. You're the strongest person I know." I hugged my son and thought about how far we had both come, how much we had grown through this ordeal. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room looking at the photos David had taken during the party. Photos of Greg's happy face covered in cake frosting, of Amanda laughing at something Lisa said, of Jessica interviewing me about the importance of speaking up against injustice, of all of us together, like a real family, messy and complicated and imperfect, but real. And I thought about that woman I had been a year ago, the one who baked cakes and stayed quiet and accepted being treated as less than, and I barely recognized her. The Thorntons had thought they could exclude me, erase me, make me disappear. But instead, they had awakened something in me that had been sleeping for too long. A sense of my own worth, a willingness to fight, a refusal to be invisible. Emma and Michael were in prison, paying for their crimes. Amanda was rebuilding her life with humility and grace. David had found happiness and was being the father and son he was meant to be, and Greg, my precious grandson, knew that his grandma Marilyn was someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. So, yes, I won. Not in the way I had imagined when I first contacted Jessica Chen, not through crushing my enemies or gloating over their downfall, but in a much deeper way. I won by reclaiming my dignity, by finding my voice, by refusing to be dismissed, by turning pain into purpose and rejection into redemption. I won by becoming the person I was always meant to be, strong and brave and unafraid, and that victory, the victory over my own fear and silence, was worth more than any revenge could ever be. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed that night, I felt grateful. Grateful for the hardship that had forced me to grow. Grateful for the rejection that had pushed me to act. Grateful for the people who had supported me through it all, and grateful that at 69 years old, I had discovered it was never too late to stand up, speak out, and claim your place in the world. The party might have been for family only a year ago, but now I understood something Amanda never did. Family isn't about money or status or who you exclude. It's about who shows up, who fights for you, who values you, and by that definition, I was surrounded by more family than I had ever had before. And that small gift I left on their doorstep on Greg's birthday, that homemade cake and adventure book, had indeed been the beginning of their end. But more importantly, it had been the beginning of my new beginning. Proof that even the smallest acts of love and defiance can change everything. That one person really can make a difference, and that justice, real justice, isn't about destruction. It's about truth and accountability and the courage to speak up even when your voice shakes. This is my story. The story of how I went from being the grandmother who wasn't good enough to be invited to a party, to being the woman who brought down a corrupt empire, to being the advocate who helps others find their voice, to being simply Marilyn. A woman who learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, but by her own actions and values and courage. And if there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Never let anyone make you feel invisible. Never accept being treated as less than, and never underestimate the power of one person who decides enough is enough and chooses to fight back with truth and integrity and an unshakable belief in their own worth. That's how you win. Not by destroying others, but by refusing to let others destroy you. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, I smiled, knowing that little Greg would grow up with a grandmother who had shown him that strength isn't about money or power or status. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and that's a legacy worth more than all the Thornton millions could ever buy.